Good evening there, everybody. What is happening? Hopefully, y'all are having a wonderful day today. So, when it comes down to it, I thought, of course, that I would review this little video and talk about the subject that I found to be very particularly interesting. And this is going to be a video reviewed by that of the Paulie Malignaggi channel that I found to be very particularly interesting. And Paulie, he's usually a pretty decent commentator and a decent analyzer. Of course, he has his controversies, every single once in a while, and do I necessarily agree with everything that he has to say? Not necessarily, but when it comes down to it, I still think that he's a very interesting character and a decent analyzer. And of course, he was a guy that formerly, actually was in the boxing ring. He actually was a champion in two separate weight classes. A lot of people overall would say that he doesn't belong in the Hall of Fame. I would personally put him in the Hall of Fame because he's at least a two-weight division champion. But of course, that would be up to certain people. But anyways, this conversation is going to be about that of Mr. Saul Canelo Alvarez, who of course recently in his next fight has set up the fight that of Jaime Munguia. And of course, he's getting a lot of flack for that because of course, a lot of people want to see that of the David Benavidez fight. And it's somewhat well warranted because of course, everyone wants to see that David Benavidez fight. But the question is why is this fight not happening? Because according to Benavidez's side, they said that they sent Canelo Alvarez $55 million. According to Canelo and Eddie Reynoso, they said that they didn't send the deal or that they didn't receive a deal. What Benavidez's team did say is that they did receive an offer from Canelo Alvarez's side for $5 million, but then allegedly they didn't hear anything back from him. Now, which side is telling the truth? To be honest with you, I can't really tell. But I would not be surprised once again if Canelo Alvarez, if maybe him and Benavidez made a deal behind the scenes to possibly, boast this fight a little bit more so both of them can make the most amount of clams and money that they possibly can. Or it could just be that Canelo is avoiding that of David Benavidez. It could be that he's ducking him. I'm not really quite sure. But once again, David Benavidez, we'll have to see if he's waiting overall for Canelo Alvarez to get stripped. We'll have to see what ends up going on here. But the fact that after allegedly he's going to go, or not allegedly, but, the fact overall, that he's going to go apparently for that, title eliminator against Alexander Vosdik. And then apparently after that, he might move up to cruiserweight. I mean, to me, that just really wouldn't make any sense, especially if you're trying to fight Canelo, unless maybe overall there was discussion behind the scenes about, maybe making the fight a little bit bigger between two Mexican fighters or something like that. That way Canelo can fight Jaime Munguia and then Jamal Charlo, who of course isn't Mexican, but, still a black American fighter, a name that a lot of people would know, and then Benavidez fights those two guys. I'm not really quite sure, but to me that just came across as a little bit weird. But anyways, we'll figure that out eventually. We'll see what ends up happening with that. But anyways, in this video, I just thought that I would talk about this because Canelo Alvarez, of course, there's always a lot of talks about him, about where does he truly rank within that amongst the Mexican greats, or how great of a fighter is he actually? And I guess it truly depends overall where you rank him, once again, or it depends overall on how you look at him. Now, of course, a lot of the channels that I tend to review, especially with that of the LDBC and new media, they say that Canelo, in their opinion, is just a good or average Mexican fighter, and that he's only highly promoted because of his skin color and overall because he has the complexion for the protection, when it comes down to it. And listen, I have no doubt in my mind that Canelo Alvarez, somewhat being a, Caucasian Hispanic when it comes down to it, I have no doubt in my mind that, that's a part of the reason of why Canelo Alvarez is so marketable and why he gets so many views and overall, why he's somewhat pushed. But at the end of the day, a lot of the times, especially from these LDBC and new media channels, it's way too hard for them to admit a certain amount of bias and vitriol that they end up having, especially for, let's be real, a lot of these Caucasian fighters. They're not really a big fan of any fighters that are non-black American fighters, but they have especially a big vitriol for that of Caucasian fighters. They don't like Canelo Alvarez. They don't like Tyson Fury. They don't like Alexander Usyk. They don't like any fighter that could be a Caucasian or non-black American fighter that could be looked at as potentially the best within their weight class when it comes down to it. So when it comes down to it, like I said, whenever you talk about the LDBC channels, they only talk positively about certain non-black American fighters when it benefits them. And when is the two times that it usually benefits them? Either A, when they know that they can use that person's name to tear down another name, like that of Benavidez and Canelo, or Teofimo Lopez with Lomachenko, or something else like that. Or B, they'll prop them up because they know that they're not truly the best within a few weight classes and that they're not really going to stand a chance against that elite black fighter. Overall, that they're eventually going to get in the ring with like Josh Taylor versus Terrence Crawford or Errol Spence Jr. You remember how they propelled Josh Taylor immediately into the top 5 pound per pound when he was unified? And you know what? To be fair, if you had him there, all that's well and good, all that's cool. But once again, when it comes to Lomachenko or Fury or Canelo or someone else like that, they're a little bit hesitant to do that. And the reason why that is because they know that those fighters are looked at as great within the multitude of weight classes. And for you to truly be the number one pound for pound fighter, you can't just be looked at as debatably the best within your weight class. Usually you have to be looked at as debatably the best within possibly some of the weight divisions around you. It just is what it is. And Josh Taylor was never going to be that. That's why they promoted him as being top 5 pound for pound, because all that was going to happen is that he was going to get in the ring against Terrence Crawford or Errol Spence Jr., get his ass kicked against either one of those fighters or both of those fighters, and then whoever the winner of that fight was going to be, they'll say, wow, do you see that they defeated a top 5 pound for pound fighter when it comes down to it? But if they were in Canelo Alvarez's weight class or something like that, they wouldn't be saying that. You notice that they don't have David Benavidez within their top 5 pound per pound or their top 10 pound per pound. Now, to be fair, he doesn't have a belt, but neither did Jaron Boots Ennis. And you see Jaron Boots Ennis overall being on some of their top 10 pound per pound lists. But it is what it is. Anyways, this conversation was very particularly interesting once again because Canelo Alvarez, he's always kind of talked about in certain circles in different lights, but I'm going to kind of give my perspective. And if for those of you that have already known my perspective for a very long time, overall already my opinion about Canelo, that not only is he a great fighter, but he's an all-time great fighter, and that he's up there with any Mexican great in history, period. But the reason why I wanted to talk about this is because this has actually been a conversation that I've been wanting to talk about for a very long time, which is that of the conversation about who was greater or who was the better fighter or who would have won in a potential matchup. And apparently this is, a type of, videos that they do over here at the Polymaj Nagi YouTube show, where they have a thing called a sparring session, where they talk about potential matchups that could have happened. And it's very particularly interesting. I think that it's a genius move. I think overall that it's a very good segment. So we're going to talk about it here because a lot of the times, especially when Canelo Alvarez is talked about, he's oftentimes talked about with that of Oscar De La Hoya, because Oscar De La Hoya also was a formerly great Mexican-American fighter. Canelo, of course, is from Mexico. Oscar De La Hoya is from California in America. But when it comes down to it, overall, they're oftentimes compared not only because they were two Mexican descent fighters, but on top of that, because Oscar De La Hoya also was his former promoter, talking about Canelo, of course. So the question is, overall, is that who would have won a fight between these two guys? Who is the better fighter, the more skilled fighter? And on top of that, who is the greater fighter? But anyways, let's get straight into it. Let's see what both Paulie Malignaggi and Chris Algieri have to say, what these two former champs have to say. Let's get into it.
Okay, don't know what that has to do with round two, but we're gonna go we're gonna go to round two. Paulie, you're gonna start this one. This is a lot of people were asking about this fantasy fight. A primed Oscar De La Hoya, guess at 154, but we're gonna have it at 154. Oscar De La Hoya against Canelo at 154. Who wins this fight? Who would win that fight? Paulie, you're starting round two. Ring the bell.
Well, before Paulie really goes into it, and also before Chris Algieri really goes into it, if you're just asking me, who do I personally believe wins a fight between Canelo and Oscar De La Hoya, it really depends at one point in time in your career, in their careers, that you're talking about, and on top of that, at what weight class. This is just my personal view. I'll just pretty much rip off the Band-Aid from the start. Canelo Alvarez, in my view, is not only the greater fighter compared to Oscar De La Hoya, but he's the better fighter. It just is what it is. Now, in terms of accomplishments, there are certain things that you can compare there. Of course, Oscar, I believe, is a 5-division champ, if not even a 6. I can't really remember, but I thought that he was a 5-division champ. Canelo, of course, is only a 4. But the accomplishments are comparable enough. And on top of that, Canelo, in my view, has just won too many big fights in his career, whether they be bigger or smaller than him or the same size as him, for Oscar De La Hoya ever to be counted over Canelo. That's just my personal view. It is what it is. But talking about a potential fight, especially as what they said at 154, that would have been interesting because Oscar De La Hoya, I won't say that he was necessarily at the peak form of his career, but, he definitely had a little bit more work at 154 and he would have been more experienced, overall than that of Canelo Alvarez. Now, some people may say, what are you talking about? Canelo Alvarez was way more than enough experience. he had 40-something fights, overall when he was at 154. And that's true. But at the end of the day, I'm talking about elite caliber competition. And that's why, like, like a lot of the Floyd Mayweather Jr. fans, I also don't understand, like, when I say that Canelo, that when he lost to Floyd Mayweather Jr., I'm not going to make the excuse saying that Canelo, was way too green. But to say that he was at his absolute mountaintop peak, I don't think that that would be correct either. Because Canelo Alvarez and Floyd Mayweather Jr., Floyd had been in so many championship level fights where he already knew what level to take it to against Canelo Alvarez. Canelo had not really been in a fight like that before, other than that of Austin Trout. He had never met a fighter ever in his life like Floyd Mayweather. Now, do I think that Canelo, in my view, is a more skilled fighter than Mayweather? Do I think overall that he would have beat him even potentially at their peaks? I don't think that he's greater than Mayweather, and I don't think he's more skilled than Mayweather. But, when it comes down to it, I don't think that Canelo was at his absolute peak. I think he was in his prime, but I don't think that he was at his absolute peak when he faced Mayweather. But it is what it is. But anyways, Oscar De La Hoya, of course, he had a good run in 154, but if you were just to ask me, personally who I still would take, I still probably would go with that at Canelo Alvarez. Oscar was a great 154 pounder. Personally, in my view, other than Fernando Vargas, I'm not really sure if he defeated a whole lot of great fighters there. He did defeat Ricardo Mayorga for the WBC belt a little bit later on, but Ricardo Mayorga was a guy that basically was a bar brawler. That guy had no technique whatsoever. He pretty much made his career off of the upset of the century against that of Hernan Forrest, a guy that was able to outbox Shane Mosley, I believe, 2 times. And then he was able to get a good knockout in the first fight and then outbox him in the second fight. And other than that, Ricardo Mayorga never really was able to win any of the big fights in his career. He pretty much got his ass whooped against any other elite boxer in his career. He talked a lot of shit, but he could never usually back it up. It is what it is. And as for Fernando Vargas, talented fighter, but not the greatest chin in the world. And on top of that, Paulie is also going to state here that, he believes that both Fernando Vargas and Oscar De La Hoya would beat Canelo 154. Do I agree with that? No, absolutely not. I think Oscar maybe would have had a chance, but Fernando Vargas absolutely not. And Fernando Vargas, very decently talented fighter, but he's very quickly became one of the more overrated talents or overrated fighters that you'll hear about within recent history within the past 30 plus years. Like Fernando Vargas is one of those fighters that I always keep on hearing about, but then when you talk about his actual results, he never actually came through. It is what it is.
Canelo Alvarez has a lot of trouble with guys with good jabs. If you notice, even the smaller Cotto gave him some problems in that fight because of his accurate.
Cotto, in my view, once again, one of the more underrated fighters of all time. He doesn't really get talked about quite as often because he doesn't have quite the Arbrants, or quite the big Mexican fan base. He's from Puerto Rico, and a lot of Puerto Rican fighters don't get, they have a big fan base, but they don't really get talked about quite in the same light as what some of the Mexican fighters do. Cotto is right there, in my view, with Oscar De La Hoya, Tommy Hearns, Sugar Shane Mosley, maybe even Bernard Hopkins if you want to put him there. But I would probably say Bernard maybe is a bit greater than some of those guys just because of so many of the big wins in his career. But Cotto is right there with De La Hoya and Sugar Shane Mosley. Those guys were guys that were potential top 5 pound-for-pound fighters, but, they just couldn't usually win against the guy that was number 1 pound-for-pound in the world. I would have loved to have seen a fight between Oscar De La Hoya and Miguel Cotto. I don't know really who I would have bet on. Maybe Oscar De La Hoya, especially at 147, because he would have been quicker of foot and quicker of hand speed. But Cotto, in my view, also would have had better head movement, had better defense, been a more intelligent boxer, and debatably more power. For those of you that did not see Ricardo Mayorga in an interview at one point in time, when he was asked a question about Gennady Golovkin, he said that the hardest puncher that he ever fought was Miguel Cotto. And for a fighter that was probably a natural 147 pounder to fight someone like a Felix Tito Trinidad and an Oscar De La Hoya, for Miguel Cotto to be the hardest puncher that he ever fought, that says a lot. Now, who knows? Maybe he was being disingenuous. I don't know. But it seemed legitimate to me. And Cotto, of course, is known as one of the hardest punchers ever.
Well-placed jab, well-timed jab. Erislan De Lara is a good boxer. Also gave...
Lara would have been another great fight to see Oscar De La Hoya in as well. Because, well, whatever people really want to say about Oscar De La Hoya, there's a reason why after he moved away from 135, why he started to lose a lot of the bigger fights in his career. He got embarrassed by Sugar Shane Mosley when he moved up 2 weight classes. And Sugar Shane Mosley, although he's a great fighter, he's also, somewhat limited, especially in his defense. And, also somewhat in his offensive maneuvers. I'm not going to state that he's a one-dimensional fighter, but a lot of the times he only usually has one game plan. Sugar Shane Mosley, is a guy that a lot of the times whenever he got in there against elite superior boxers, he had a lot of problems. Whether it be Miguel Cotto, whether it be against Floyd Mayweather, whether it be against, some other guys, even Fernand Forrest for those two fights. When it came down to it, Sugar Shane Mosley also was a guy that had a little bit of a limited skill set, and Oscar De La Hoya lost to him.
Canelo problems, even though he's a southpaw. Guys with jabs who have a busy style tend to give Canelo Alvarez problems. So it's hard to pick against Oscar De La Hoya in this fight. He has the
at 154. That definitely was true. Canelo Alvarez, for an elite fighter, he definitely had more of a problem guarding and blocking and avoiding jabs, especially early on in his career. But eventually Canelo became a little bit better at it. I'm not going to state that he's the best at defending the jab still when it comes down to it, but he's definitely gotten a lot better at it. And I would even say that he's very good overall at it. I wouldn't say that he's the most elite defender of the jab that I've ever seen, but he's definitely got a lot better at it. One could even say that he's great at defending the jab now. But of course, during the 154-pound reign, Canelo had a very big problem with the jab. Very big problem with the jab. We've seen it with Lara. We've seen it with Mayweather. We've seen it with a couple of other guys. He had a very big problem avoiding a jab.
Power to keep it respectable, as his knockout over Fernando Vargas at 154 pounds showed. But at the same time, a busy, established power jab.
Well, yeah, he knocked out Fernando Vargas, and we all know that Oscar De La Hoya has pop in his punches. We all know that he has some pop, that he has some power. But what is knocking out Fernando Vargas really prove? I mean, Fernando Vargas had the chin overall of a candy bar. It just is what it is. There's no offense against the dude. The guy was a talented boxer, but in terms of a chin, the guy had no chin.
Speed jab.
And once again, very talented, but the way that people talk about that dude, like you would expect him to be like, this ferocious killer when it comes down to, like, Fernando Vargas was a very good fighter. He was a nice fighter. Great? No. In terms of all-time great, no. Great talent. Great fighter? No.
A jab that is very hard to deal with, as well as the combination punching that Canelo really, really dislikes to deal with, And so between the great jab that Oscar De La Hoya has and the combination punching Oscar De La Hoya has, those are two kryptonite things that Canelo really wouldn't be able to deal with. And also Canelo's sense of timing. Oscar also has a sense of timing, so he can disrupt your sense of timing. Canelo really relies on slowing the pace down with his sense of timing. I don't see how he would be able to do that with Oscar De La Hoya, who has, I think, a better sense of timing than Canelo.
I'm going to preface Oscar's.
When you talk about overall, in my view, who's better in some of the categories, I think that, to be quite honest with you, just in my personal view, that the only categories that I would really give Oscar De La Hoya over that of Canelo Alvarez is hand speed and foot speed. That's really about it. And using his feet a little bit more, because Canelo has never really had the quickest feet, and sometimes his feet can be a little bit clunky. But other than that, there's really nothing else that Oscar De La Hoya beats Canelo Alvarez in. He doesn't beat him in head movement. He doesn't beat him in boxing IQ. He doesn't beat him in defense. He doesn't beat him in chin and the ability to take a punch. He doesn't beat him in punching power. He doesn't beat him in any other category than hand speed and foot speed. That's really about it. No other categories.
My guy. But listen, when we talk about fantasy fights...
And Oscar De La Hoya also, by the way, was not the best at defending a jab. To be quite honest with you, Oscar De La Hoya was not really the best at defense, period. I'm not going to state that he was the worst defensive fighter that I ever seen. But Oscar De La Hoya, a lot of the times, even in certain fights where it shouldn't have been as close, like against Corte, even though he was a very dangerous opponent, Oscar De La Hoya, there's a big part of the reason why he lost so many fights, because Oscar De La Hoya overall, once again, he was not, this defensive master. He also got hit way too much. And if you're talking about who the better counterpuncher was, in my view, it's Canelo.
Normally talking about them in their absolute prime. But since you picked a weight class, it changes around this question quite a bit.
I agree with that. And when you talk about, prime v prime or peak v peak, I don't think that there's any doubt about it. I'd pick Canelo Alvarez. No doubt about it. And some people might say, oh, you don't know nothing about that Oscar De La Hoya, all sorts of stuff. I've seen Oscar fight. Great fighter. Once again, Oscar's one of those fighters that was really great early on in his career, and he had a great amount of buzz. He's one of those guys, that was really great at the 135-pound weight class. And, he was still great in every single weight class that he was in, mainly besides maybe 160. But, when it comes down to it overall, once again, Oscar De La Hoya, because people always, whenever I make this comparison, people are like, oh, Canelo ain't above Oscar, dude, just stop it. Oscar was able to beat Pernell Sweet Pea Whitaker and Chavez Sr., like two of the greatest fighters. Like, right, but those guys are pretty much like natural 135 to 140 pounders. Like, what does that really say? Like, to me, that doesn't really mean anything. I mean, the fact that you were able to beat those fighters, great, but I mean, that's like Devin Haney or Teofimo Lopez, them being able to beat Vasily Lomachenko, someone who's highly skilled but really a natural 130 pounder, and then they're never able to beat the people really of their own natural size. What does that really state? And there's no offense against Oscar De La Hoya, but like I stated, against a guy, the elite boys who pretty much were his own same size, who did he ever really beat? It just is what it is. He always came up short in a lot of those fights. He came up majorly short against Sugar Shane Mosley. He came up short against Floyd Mayweather. He came up a little bit short against Felix Tito Trinidad, or at least blew the second half of that fight when it came down to it. Oscar De La Hoya, once again, great fighter. As great as what many people state? No.
154, De La Hoya was just not the same guy he was in those lighter weight classes. At 40 and 40.
I would agree with that. He definitely wasn't as fast. He definitely overall wasn't as quick. And Oscar De La Hoya, in order to beat Canelo, he would have to have those. He would have to have those advantages. Now, if you're talking about at the 154-pound weight class, once again, because Oscar would have debatably had more experience at that point in time in his career. When it comes down to it, if you're talking about Canelo when he was at 154, then yeah, Oscar potentially could have won that fight because Canelo was still learning at that curve in his career. But if you're talking about the Canelo that I seen against Miguel Cotto, the Canelo that I seen against Gennady Golovkin in the rematch, the Canelo that I seen against Danny Jacobs and Caleb Plant and Billy Joe Saunders, Oscar's not beating that Canelo because Canelo's just gonna back him up when it comes down to it. He's gonna probe him with his jab. He's gonna use his jab. He's going to do a body attack very early on, and he's pretty much overall going to outbox, Oscar De La Hoya. He can pretty much overall pressure him, and he can more than likely outbox him. But Canelo would pretty much outpressure, I think, Oscar De La Hoya. He would have his power when it comes down to it, and his elite defense. I think it would be very hard for Oscar De La Hoya really to get solid punches in against Canelo. I'm not saying that it wouldn't happen, but I think that Canelo Alvarez would get more solid punches in than that of Oscar. Oscar was just too hittable. And on top of that, if you ever watched Oscar fight, there's no offense. I mean, sometimes he would have the head movement, but oftentimes more than not, he would have the head movement of a number 2 pencil. It's like the dude a lot of the times never really moved his head that well. And you can tell that him being in those lighter weight classes earlier on in his career and him being taller and lengthier than a lot of his opponents, you can tell that had a little bit of an effect on him as well.
37, I mean, I got De La Hoya all day, but Canelo didn't really fight in those weight, especially when he was at his best. And at 54, De La Hoya just didn't have the output. When you talk about things that disrupted Canelo early on, it was guys that had a really good jab.
I also agree with that.
It was southpaws. You mentioned the Lara fight, but De La Hoya is...
Well, it wasn't just southpaws. Floyd Mayweather Jr. gave him a hell of a time, too, and he was a orthodox fighter. Gennady Golovkin, of course, that was at 160. He gave him a hell of a time with the jab, and, he was a orthodox fighter. But Oscar De La Hoya, in my view, to be quite honest with you, he had a very good jab. Would I say that he has as good of a jab as Gennady Golovkin? No, I wouldn't. When it comes down to it, and Lara also would have been a very interesting fight as well. Had Oscar De La Hoya competed against Gennady Golovkin and also that of Lara, now some would debate that maybe De La Hoya is smaller than either of those fighters. I would say that De La Hoya, in my view, is about a natural 154 pounder. In my view, that's pretty much what he is. I'm not sure if Oscar would have won either of those fights. They would have been very, very tricky for him because Lara's a guy who's very defensively responsible. He's a guy that knows how to box. He's a guy that has a little bit of a problem if you pressure him a little bit, at least intelligently. But he's a guy that is an extremely intelligent boxer at his best. And Gennady Golovkin also is extremely intelligent as well, even though, of course, he has certain flaws as well. I'm not sure if Oscar would have won either of those fights.
Converted southpaw, he fights out of the righty stance, but it's guys who pick a pace. And De La Hoya at 54 just didn't have that. When he fought Shane Mosley, lost to him twice. Canelo, who was a baby, beat up Shane Mosley badly.
Well, to be fair, Mr. Chris Algieri, Sugar Shane Mosley, by the time that he fought Canelo Alvarez, he pretty much was done. I mean, he still had a little bit he was really, really, really on his last legs. So I don't think that's really, fair to compare. Sugar Shane Mosley was 40 years old pretty much by that time. He had already lost a couple of fights previously before then, got dominated by Mayweather, then by Pacquiao. So I'm not really going to compare that overall to that, same thing. But what I will say is that Oscar De La Hoya did show a lot of faults in both Sugar Shane Mosley fights because Shane Mosley, once again, great fighter, but also another guy that definitely could have came up bigger in a lot of his fights. And I don't really think that, it was a mental issue in terms of, him feeling the pressure. I just think that Sugar Shane Mosley wasn't really, in terms of his boxing IQ, I always thought that it was a little bit overrated. He comes across as a super slick fighter and a super intelligent fighter because of his athleticism and because he's a slick black American boxer. So a lot of people, they take a look at that on the surface and they expect him to be a Floyd Mayweather or something like that, but he's not. And that's a part of the reason why he got outboxed so thoroughly by Miguel Cotto, by Mayweather, and by some other guys.
That weight, I can't see Canelo not picking that fight up. De La Hoya wasn't able to sustain
I agree.
the action.
And peak versus peak, Canelo also takes that fight. And I know that a lot of people, they're not going to agree with that, but it is what it is. De La Hoya, in my view, would not be the best version of Canelo.
Especially late in fights. Any other version, I mean, De La Hoya is my guy. It's really hard to go against him, but we're being real.
Any other version of Oscar De La Hoya also loses to Canelo Alvarez. Let me tell you that right now, Mr. Chris Algieri. Any other version of of Oscar De La Hoya also loses to Canelo Alvarez, period.
Here, weight classes are there for a reason. Canelo just too big and too explosive.
We're being realistic. Canelo went to distance with Matthew Hatton, and a guy who had never even fought at 154 pounds. They had to bring him up just so the guy could win a world championship. We're being realistic here, so let's keep it realistic. Oscar De La Hoya at 154 stops Fernando Vargas, who probably also beats Canelo Alvarez at 154 pounds. We're being realistic. Oscar's...
No, he doesn't, Paulie. Just stop it. And you can tell overall that Paulie, with him being as emotional as what he's being, that there's something a little bit extra here. Every time that Paulie has always talked about Canelo, at least from what I've seen, there seems to be a little bit of a personal issue there. And maybe he believes that Canelo is moving in a certain way like some of these other guys. I get it. But at the end of the day, you can tell that Paulie that he has a little bit of vitriol towards that of Canelo, or he at least overall despises certain things about him or doesn't like certain things that Canelo Alvarez does. No, Fernando Vargas would not beat Canelo Alvarez at 154. No, he would not. Fernando Vargas was a dude that was known for losing every big fight in his career. Okay? Every big fight.
Jib is still world class at 154 pounds. His combination punching is still there, even if it's not as busy as when he was smaller. And we're being...
And De La Hoya was slower at the 154 pound weight division as well. By that time, he had already suffered a little bit of damage throughout some fights. He was still great at the 154 pound weight division. That's why he damn near won all the belts there. But at the end of the day, Oscar De La Hoya, he's still overall, I would not have bet on him to beat Canelo. He would have been too slow in my view, too hittable. Even the best version of Oscar De La Hoya would have been too slow and not too slow, but too hittable for that of Canelo Alvarez. He just didn't have enough head movement, and he didn't have great enough defense, in my view, to beat someone like a Canelo Alvarez. Just in my personal view.
Realistic. The Shane Canelo fought is not the Shane Oscar fought. He's 175 years old.
Yeah, and Canelo
I would agree with that.
was 22 years old. It's a different guy. But listen, at 54, Canelo would just be too much in terms of explosiveness, combination punching, and he would not be disrupted by De La Hoya's jab. De La Hoya was just not busy enough at 154. And really, size-wise, he really wasn't a 54-pounder either. No.
I thought Oscar De La Hoya was a 154-pounder. He was about the same size as Mayorga and the same size as Fernando Vargas. He was a 154-pounder. He wasn't a 160-pounder, but he was a 154-pounder. I don't personally believe that. Oscar looked big enough to be a 154-pounder. Because in my view, he was bigger than most welterweights.
It's Canelo Alvarez. De La Hoya, I love him. He's great. He's a legend. But at 154, he just was not the same guy. And the Fernando Vargas fight, Fernando fought with too much pride and too much anger and fought with that Mexicano blood. That's why he got caught the way he did.
Yes, and once again was an overrated fighter that eventually would feel the pressure and the power behind fighters, and he usually would crumble. Especially after that, fight against that of Felix Tito Trinidad. It is what it is.
Canelo wouldn't do that.
That was a good one. I got to say, Paulie's fire really won the day, and he won that round 10-9. Paulie Malignaggi takes a 1-point lead.
Well, Oscar's jab doesn't win the day either.
Basically, you just got to yell more. You got to yell louder to get...
We're being real.
Oscar's jab is very good, but you can tell once again that Paulie is that he's being a little bit emotional here. Listen, at the end of the day, do I believe that Oscar De La Hoya would have beat Canelo, at least the best version of Canelo, 154? No, I don't. Do I think that peak v peak, like the best version of De La Hoya that I've ever seen versus the best version of Canelo that De La Hoya would have beat Canelo? No. Once again, besides foot speed and hand speed, there's no other categories that De La Hoya beats Canelo in. And certain people can disagree with that, but it is what it is. Canelo pretty much beats him in every single category, and that's why Canelo, even when he's moving up the weight classes against A-grade level fighters, he can beat them even if they're bigger. De La Hoya is not a type of guy to where he can usually do that. Because the 154 pounders were not really bigger than that of Oscar. Oscar was pretty much a natural 154 pounder. And if we're really going to go there, I mean, Fernando Vargas was probably an A-grade fighter at the time, but, let's be real. Fernando was a guy that, had the chin overall of a candy bar. Like I said, he had a very weak chin, and on top of that, he wasn't the most intelligent fighter in pressurized situations. That's why he lost so many big fights in his career. And then the other, the second best fighter that he defeated there was Ricardo Mayorga. It's like, please.
All right, fans, am I not getting robbed out of my pants here?
Give us
the first round.
I agree you are getting robbed in terms of logic, but it seems like overall that the referee here, or the judge, whatever you want to call him here, that he seems to be going off of Paulie's emotion, or maybe he has his own little bias as well. But I mean, if you think that Oscar beats Canelo, that's up to you. I just don't personally agree with it. I don't think that Oscar would beat Canelo Alvarez. I don't think that the best version of Oscar De La Hoya would beat the best version of Canelo. That's just my personal view on it. I just think that Canelo would be too skilled, too powerful, too high a boxing IQ. Just is what it is.
The first round was insane.
Well, you barely have a shirt on, so, maybe you are getting robbed of your pants. But Paulie takes a 1-point lead going into round 3. All right, Chris, you're going to start this one. You're only 1 point behind. Don't get rattled, Chris. You're a champ. Don't get rattled. Round 3.
Commish, just disclaimer, Commish. Don't go giving him a freebie round. Just to
he already gave you a freebie in the first round.
Just to go into the last round.
He already gave you a freebie.
Just to go into the last round with all the play for.
These two guys actually are very good together. I think that they have great chemistry. But anyways, when it comes down to it, once again, just to kind of talk about it, where do I think Canelo Alvarez ranks in terms of the Mexican greats? And just in terms of greats in general, I think that Canelo Alvarez is an all-time great fighter. And in terms of Mexican greats, I mean, to me, there's really only 1 or 2 fighters that you maybe could debate above him. But realistically, there's only really one fighter in Mexican history that you really could debate over him. And that's probably Chavez Sr. That's really about it. A lot of people overall, of course, would debate Salvador Sanchez or Juan Manuel Marquez. But those fighters are not above Canelo. And I like Salvador Sanchez. Some people would actually debate that he's the most skilled fighter of all time. That's up to you. But at the end of the day, I can't put someone that's only had a few title defenses. I can't put someone overall that high on my list when they only had a few title defenses, because we don't do that for other fighters. Tyson Fury, who only has wins against 2 great fighters or 3 great fighters in his career. We don't call him the greatest heavyweight of all time, because he doesn't quite have the established resume for it. So it is what it is. Unfortunately, Salvador Sanchez met an unfortunate end. I believe that he was in a car accident. I believe that killed him. If it wasn't that, then it was some other accident. I believe that ended up happening, but I believe it was a car accident. Great fighter, but greater than Canelo, I can't say that because he just doesn't have the accomplishments. It is what it is. Nowhere near, and for the standards, for someone to be remembered as the greatest of all time in their particular sport, especially in boxing, you have to be more than likely a multiple weight division champion or definitively overall the best in that weight class of all time. So it is what it is, But anyways, in terms of Chavez, I think that that's really the only fighter that you could debate over Canelo. And to be honest with you, Canelo could also be over Chavez Sr. It is what it is. But, a lot of these LDBC and new media channels especially, some of the videos that I like to review, they're on their pro-racial bullshit. They always love to say this stuff about, Canelo, when it comes down to it, I can't even have him over Marco Antonio Barrera or Eric Morales, all this other bullshit, or Juan Manuel Marquez. Those guys are great fighters for sure. First ballot Hall of Famers. Even all-time greats if you want to place them like that. But Canelo Alvarez is a guy that can go up the weight classes and beat fighters overall that are bigger than him. He's defeated a multitude of skilled fighters. And at one point in time, he was debated as the #1 pound-for-pound fighter. And if Canelo retired today, he could be easily remembered as the greatest fighter of his generation. At least you could heavily debate it. You can never debate that Marco Antonio Barrera and Eric Morales and Juan Manuel Marquez, you can never debate them as the best fighters of their generation ever. Ever. It is what it is. And, I like all those fighters, but Eric Morales, there's a reason why, people talk about Canelo's, some of his controversial decisions, and I understand. But the Erislandy Lara fight still was a fight that could have went either way. They give it to Canelo. It is what it is. The second fight was a fight that also potentially could have went to either way, but I thought Canelo just pulled it out. So, it is what it is against Gennady Golovkin. I did think that he lost the first fight, but in the second fight, he redeemed himself. But against Marquez, he ended up losing to Pacquiao 2 times out of the 4 times they fought. Of course, a lot of people want to say that Marquez got robbed, but he didn't really get robbed. He lost those fights narrowly. I've watched them multiple times. It is what it is. And he would have lost the 4th fight, had Pacquiao not been stupid, and reckless and careless and, ran straight into that right hand at the end of the round. He would have beat him probably a 3rd time. But it is what it is, and and he also got completely outboxed by Timothy Bradley. Although, be it he was around 40 years old at that time. So if you want to maybe use that as somewhat of a valid excuse, I would understand. Even though he was coming off with the win over Manny Pacquiao, but it is what it is. Eric Morales, great fighter, but there's also a reason why he got completely killed against Manny Pacquiao in 2 out of the 3 fights, and also beat by Marco Antonio Barrera in some of his biggest fights in his own weight class. Marco Antonio Barrera also got beat by Junior Jones a couple times earlier on in his career, even brutally knocked out. And then, of course, he was torn to shreds against Manny Pacquiao, and also being the first time against Eric Morales. All those guys are great fighters, but they're not on the level of Canelo. And people overall might disagree with me, but it is what it is. Those fighters are not on the same level of Canelo, period. It is what it is. But anyways, that's pretty much about it for today. As for the Oscar De La Hoya conversation, who do I think would have won that fight? I probably would have went with that of Canelo Alvarez, but you never know. You never know. But anyways, that's pretty much about it for today. Thank you so much for watching. I'll talk to you all later.